Today we are going to look at the Antebellum Era, which is the time period before the Civil War in American history. Our focus will be on the reform movements of the day, like the women's rights movement and the growing abolition movement against slavery. We'll also look at the differences between the North and South, which will ultimately lead to the two sides going to war in 1861. It's Antebellum Era. The Second Great Awakening was a religious movement that swept across America around 1800 through individuals like Charles Finney. The movement was characterized by revivals where large groups came together to worship. These revivals were emotional experiences that emphasized salvation and were very popular in the West. The Second Great Awakening argued that all people belonged to the same God and brought Christianity to African Americans, especially slave communities. This movement led to an increase in American churchgoing. In 1800, 1 out of 15 Americans belonged to a church, and in 1850, 1 out of 6 did. The Second Great Awakening would play a major role in the reform movements that emerged in the 19th century, as proponents argued that individuals could better themselves and society. Women in antebellum America were expected to marry and raise children. Housework and child care were her responsibilities. This is known as the Cult of Domesticity, which defines the woman's role as being basically the moral educator who raises children. These women have very few legal rights, and we look at some statistics, it's telling. By 1850, 20% of women had actually worked before they were married, 10% of women were employed, and those who were employed were getting paid half as much as men for the same job. Women were not allowed to vote or sit on juries, and once women did marry, any money and property that they owned went to their husband. Using the ideology from the Second Great Awakening and wanting to better themselves and their communities, women would find a way to get involved. They would play a vital role in the abolition movement against slavery, the temperance movement against alcohol, education reform, health reform, and even a movement to improve their own rights. And during this time period, we will see women step out and start doing things that society deemed inappropriate, like challenging Victorian dress. We start seeing women wear pants, right? And the men in society are shocked. They can't believe what they're seeing. A woman wearing pants is a strange, strange thing. But women are starting to speak out, which we're going to see at Seneca Falls in 1848. Women played a major role in the abolition movement against slavery. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said of this experience, though women were members of the National Anti-Slavery Society, accustomed to speak and vote in all its conventions, and to take an equally active part with men in the whole anti-slavery struggle, and were there as delegates from associations of men and women, as well as those distinctly of their own sex, yet all alike were rejected because they were women. So women are allowed to participate, but again, they're not taken as seriously because of their gender. And in 1848, we'll see Angelina Grimke and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organize a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. These women and some men got together in Seneca Falls in 1848 and laid out their case against the Cult of Domesticity. They drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which was their version of the Declaration of Independence, but instead of declaring independence from the King of England, they were declaring their independence from men. They took America's founding document and altered it to read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Like the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Sentiments listed grievances. The he here is male society. They argued that men had not allowed women to vote. Men had established a society with two moral codes. Virtue was for women, vice was for men. He had taken her property upon marriage and any money that she earned. Basically, they argued that men had forced women into dependency, had denied them the opportunity to go to college, had denied women the same rights provided to Native Americans and foreigners, who, according to the women at Seneca Falls, were the most ignorant and degraded in American society. They had kept women out of the political process and had denied them the opportunity to be pastors, preachers, doctors, and lawyers. This meeting made men uncomfortable, and some women at the convention were also uncomfortable with the thought of giving themselves the right to vote. Because remember, politics at this time was separate spheres. It is not something that women got involved in. It is important to understand that the actions at Seneca Falls were a first step in a very long process for women. who would not earn the right to vote for another 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. A paradox is something that appears to contradict itself. Many in America in the 19th century viewed slavery as a paradox, as it went against the ideas that America was founded on, particularly all men are created equal. There were many views on what to do about slavery. The American Colonization Society, which was founded during the Monroe administration, wanted to send free African Americans to Liberia in Africa. There, they argued, they would have more freedom than what they have in the United States. Some argued that slavery needed to be abolished through legal channels. Others thought it might require force. But what happens is many white Americans, particularly in New England in the 1830s, begin pushing for slavery's end. Slavery was a central issue at the Constitutional Convention. Slaves were what made the Southern economy go. Most slaves did not live on large plantations, and even fewer were free. The number of slaves continued to increase even after the slave trade was ended, doubling between the years 1810 and 1830. And by 1830, a majority of slaves were born in the United States and could speak a common language. Slaves worked from dusk to dawn, always being pushed to work harder by their overseers. And some slaves were rented out to serve as blacksmiths and carpenters. And by 1850, slaves accounted for more than 10% of the American population. Abolitionism was the movement to end slavery. One prominent abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison. While many slave owners used the Bible to justify slavery, many abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison viewed slavery as violations of Christian teachings. Garrison believed that slavery needed to end immediately and slave owners should not be compensated for the slaves. Garrison published his views in his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. The publication of the first edition of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator on January 1st, 1831, marked the beginning of a much more radical abolition movement in the United States. In this first paper, Garrison wrote, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. And I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard." Garrison was the leading voice against slavery in America. He would publish his newspaper, The Liberator, once a week for 34 years, insisting that all would not be well until slaveholders repented for their sins by freeing their slaves. Frederick Douglass was another abolitionist who he thought that slavery should be ended through the political process. Douglass was a freed slave from Maryland, and we'll talk a lot more about Frederick Douglass when we get to the Civil War. But Douglass published a newspaper, the North Star, that was anti-slavery and supported the Underground Railroad, which was a system of escape routes for slaves from the South to the North and Canada. Thousands of slaves found their way to freedom through Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad. One thing that people of the South feared was slave uprisings, and there were not very many, but before the American Revolution, more than 20 South Carolinians were killed in the Stono Rebellion. And in 1800, Gabriel Prosser planned a slave rebellion around Richmond, but the plan was foiled when the plot was revealed before it began. Prosser and his 25 followers were executed. Nat Turner was born into slavery, and he was a preacher. He believed that he had been chosen by God to lead his people to freedom. And in 1831, along with 80 followers, he led an attack on 4 plantations, killing 60 white citizens in Virginia. Turner was eventually captured, tried, and executed for his actions in Virginia. The government then killed up to 200 African Americans in the area just to send a message that these types of activities would not be tolerated. The response to any slave rebellion was always the same. The government passed stricter laws on slaves and free African Americans. These slave codes limited what little rights African Americans possessed in an attempt to prevent them from organizing like Prosser and Turner did. If we look at America during the Antebellum Era, it is a country with two different sides. A North with an industrial economy where manufacturing and commerce was king, an area that favored protective tariffs as they made more people buy the goods that their factories produce. In a South where agriculture was the focus, whether it was plantations along the coast or small subsistence farms in the West, an area that opposed tariffs as they made normally cheaper foreign goods more expensive. This issue of tariffs would come to a head in South Carolina over the Tariff of 1832. John C. Calhoun, who was vice president to John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, wrote that South Carolina had the right to nullify the tariff. Let's remember that nullification is the idea that states possess the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional. The same idea Thomas Jefferson and James Madison proposed in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions more than 30 years earlier. Calhoun was arguing that South Carolina did not have to pay the tariff if they did not want to. President Jackson disagreed, arguing that federal law was supreme in this case. Calhoun resigned as vice president and went back to South Carolina just as the Nullification Crisis was beginning. When we consider the Nullification Crisis, the central issues are the tariff and states' rights, two issues that almost lead to a civil war in 1833 and that will lead to a civil war in 1861. South Carolina voted to nullify the tariff and formed an army, threatening to secede from the Union over this issue. Jackson demanded that Congress give him the power to send U.S. troops into South Carolina to collect the tariff through the force bill. While the crisis was averted through compromise, the Nullification Crisis highlights the increasing sectional tension between the two sides in the 19th century. There had always been a lack of productive, profitable agriculture in the North going back to the Pilgrims at Plymouth. They were dependent on shipping and trading, but they did invest heavily in manufacturing. Textiles was the first industry to industrialize, and eventually there were factories for any goods as unskilled laborers replaced the artisans. What we'll see is many people starting to make the move from farms to factory during the Antebellum Era. Northern industrialization led to technological advances. Railroads started popping up as a way to move goods and people. By 1860, the North had more miles of railroads than any country in the world. While the railroads were more expensive than canals and turnpikes, they were faster and could operate in the winter. From this point forward, America will lead the way when it comes to technological advances in the world. Samuel Morse's telegraph would revolutionize the way people communicated. Imagine being able to communicate with someone almost instantaneously. Okay, that's not much of a stretch for us in the age of Twitter and Facebook, but the telegraph was texting, 19th century style. It made the flow of business much faster as people could send in orders and check on prices. Northern factories brought millions of people from Europe into America. Those seeking to escape the Irish potato famine or the Depression in Germany during this time period found opportunities in American factories. These immigrants would change the culture of America and would eventually face hostility. As we know, the Southern economy was based on the cultivation of cash crops. The South only produced 10% of American manufactured goods by 1850. This is something that will be a major problem for the South when we reach the Civil War. The South also lacked the railroads of the North and depended on rivers for transportation. In 3 southern states, African Americans made up a majority of the population, showing how important slaves were in the South. And by the 19th century, cotton was king in southern plantations. Let's close the show by looking at the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's cotton gin allowed for cotton to be cleaned faster. Before, the seeds of the cotton had to be picked out by hand, which was very labor-intensive and required more slaves. The cotton gin Eli Whitney created dramatically increased how quickly cotton could be turned into thread. And while the machine made the need for slave labor less, the number of slaves actually increased as owners saw how much cotton they could produce. Between 1790 and 1810, the amount of cotton produced increased from 3,000 to 178,000 bales per year, and the number of slaves in the United States almost doubled. By 1860, King Cotton accounted for half of the Southern exports. We will discuss the political issues of the 1850s next time, but until then, good night, Albuquerque.